The dust in the ring of judgment did not just settle, it clung. It was a fine violet silt that tasted of ionized copper and the bitter sweat of a dozen dead challengers. Silas Vane knelt in the center of that choking cloud, his lungs screaming for oxygen that the thin atmosphere of Alolan Prime barely provided. His vision was a blur of bruised purples and jagged obsidian shadows, but he didn't need clear sight to know where death was coming from. He could hear it in the rhythmic, predatory thrumming of the crowd above. Thousands of Valshari warriors were leaning over the stone precipice, their bioluminescent tattoos flickering in a synchronized heartbeat of bloodlust. To them, he was a stray, a bit of cosmic grit that had tumbled out of a burning scrap ship and dared to breathe their air. He was a scavenger, a gearhead, a ghost from the stars who had survived their beasts and their traps by the skin of his teeth. But this was the final gate. This was where the logic of the scavenger met the absolute law of the blade. Across the arena, Karys stood like a statue carved from the very night itself. Her skin was the deep, lustrous violet of a nebula, marked by silver lines that glowed with a faint, agitated light. Her hair, a cascade of white-hot filament, snapped in the acrid wind. She was the High Exarch, the apex of their martial order, and in her hand she balanced the star shard. It was more than a spear. It was a 3-meter length of forged gravity glass, shimmering with a lethality that made the air around it warp. "You have lived longer than the law intended, Outworlder," Karys said. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a low resonance that seemed to vibrate directly in Silas's marrow, translated by the primitive compatch stitched into his ear. "There is no honor in a scavenger's survival. There is only the debt of the earth. Accept the shard, and let your atoms return to the dust." Silas wiped a smear of dark blood from his mouth, his fingers trembling. His jumpsuit was a tattered ruin of reinforced nylon and grease stains. He looked small. He looked like a man who was already zeroed out, a pilot whose engines had flamed out in the deep dark. But Silas Vane had spent 10 years navigating the spinning debris of the Oort rings. He had learned to read the tilt of a tumbling asteroid before his sensors could even lock on. He didn't see a goddess of war. He saw a ballistic problem. He saw the way her weight shifted to her back foot. He saw the tension in her deltoids, the slight narrowing of her emerald eyes. His brain, wired for the frantic mathematics of zero-gravity salvage, began to calculate the arc. It wasn't about strength, it was about the vector. Karys moved. It wasn't a throw, it was a rupture in reality. The star shard left her hand with a crack like a sonic boom, a streak of translucent light that promised to erase him from the ledger of the living. The crowd's roar was a physical wall of sound, a celebration of the impending kill. In that millisecond, Silas didn't think about his life or his sins. He didn't think about the crew he'd lost or the cold void waiting for him. He moved on pure, unadulterated instinct. He didn't dive left. He didn't cower. He stepped into the trajectory, his hands snapping upward not to block, but to catch the momentum at its most unstable point, just behind the spear's weighted head. The impact was like being hit by a freight train made of ice. The vibration shattered the small bones in his left pinky and sent a surge of kinetic energy through his shoulder that threatened to turn his joints to jelly. His boots skidded across the obsidian floor, carving 2 long, smoking furrows in the stone. The tip of the gravity glass stopped exactly 2 centimeters from his throat, the air humming with the sheer force of the held weapon. Silas stood there, his chest heaving, his fingers locked in a death grip around the warm, vibrating shaft of the star shard. He was alive. Silence didn't just fall over the ring of judgment. It cratered. The 1,000-voiced roar of the Valshari died in their throats as if someone had cut the power to the world. Karys remained frozen in her follow-through, her hands still extended, her face a mask of absolute shattering disbelief. Her pointed ears, usually held high in arrogant grace, twitched with a sudden, frantic uncertainty. Silas took a ragged breath, the metallic taste of the spear filling his senses. He didn't drop it. He didn't gloat. He just looked at her through the haze of violet dust, his eyes hard and defiant. "Is that all you've got?" he wheezed, his voice cracking. "Because I've had harder days on a scrap deck." From the high balcony where the elders sat, a single ancient Valshari rose. His tattoos were faded to a dull gray, and his voice, when it came, carried the weight of 10,000 cycles. The Kyrath covenant is invoked, the elder proclaimed, his words echoing through the breathless arena. The shard has been claimed. The law is not written in blood, but in the catch. Karys's eyes went wide, the silver light on her skin flaring into a panicked white. She looked at Silas as if he had just transformed into a monster from their deepest myths. "No," she whispered, the word carrying across the silent stone. "It is a mistake. He is a scavenger, a nothing." The elder slammed his staff down, the sound like a gavel. "The law does not care for your pride, Exarch." He caught the shard. "By the covenant of the first stars, he is yours, and you are his, forever." Silas felt his knees buckle. The spear clattered to the floor as his strength finally gave out. He didn't understand their laws. He didn't know the weight of the invisible chain that had just been forged around his neck. All he knew was that the executioner was staring at him with a mixture of hatred and something far more terrifying, a bond that death itself could no longer sever. He had survived the trial, but as the Valshari guards descended into the arena, not with blades drawn, but with heads bowed in a chilling, forced respect, Silas realized he had just traded one cage for another. The scavenger had caught the star, and now he was going to burn for it. The transport to the High Exarch's spire was a silent, tense affair. Silas was flanked by 4 Valshari honor guards, their heavy ceremonial armor clinking with every step. They didn't touch him. They didn't even look at him. It was as if he were a radioactive isotope, something that had to be contained but never handled directly. He was a scag, a bottom feeder who had accidentally tripped into their most sacred ritual, and the air around him was thick with their resentment. They led him through the great arch of Veloni, where the city of the Valshari sprawled like a garden of jagged glass and bioluminescent moss. Everything here was vertical, built into the sides of massive obsidian cliffs that reached for the purple suns. The architecture was sharp, aggressive, and beautiful in a way that made Silas feel even more like a smudge of grease on a fine silk tapestry. They reached the obsidian spire, the highest point in the territory. It was a needle of black stone that seemed to pierce the very clouds of Alawan Prime. The interior was surprisingly sparse. There were no chairs, no soft carpets, no comforts of the home Silas remembered from the core worlds. The walls were etched with the history of Karys's lineage, 1,000 years of war and conquest carved in glowing lines of silver. The guards stopped at the entrance to the inner sanctum and stepped aside, their ears flattened against their skulls. "Enter, bonded mate," one of them spat, the word sounding like a curse. Silas stepped inside. The air here smelled of ozone, crushed jasmine, and the sharp, cold scent of the star shard. Karys was standing by a massive open balcony that overlooked the glowing veins of the city below. She had removed her heavy shoulder guards, revealing the lean, corded muscle of her back and the intricate silver tattoos that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. She didn't turn around when he entered. "You should have let the spear kill you," she said. Her voice was cold, a blade of ice cutting through the silence of the room. "It would have been a cleaner end for both of us." Silas leaned against a stone pillar, his body screaming for rest. "My bad," he muttered, rubbing his throbbing shoulder. "I've got this annoying habit of staying alive. It's a real personality flaw." Karys turned then, her emerald eyes blazing with a fury so intense, Silas felt the hair on his arm stand up. "You mock our ways because you cannot comprehend them. The covenant was designed to unite warring clans, to bring the strongest together to ensure our survival. It was never meant for this." She gestured at him with a hand that trembled slightly. Her claws were retracted, but her presence was still that of a predator. "You are a ghost from a dying star. You have no clan, no honor, no place in the world. And now, by the law of my ancestors, I am bound to you. My dwelling is yours. My food is yours. My life is tied to yours until the suns go dark." "Look," Silas said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in his veins. "I didn't ask for this. I was just trying not to get a hole poked in my chest. If there's a way to hit the undo button on this whole bonded thing, I'm all ears. Just give me a ship, some fuel, and I'll bug out. Bug. You can tell everyone you killed me and I won't say a word." Karys took a step toward him, her height making him feel even smaller. The law is not a contract, Outworlder. It is a biological and spiritual hard lock. The elders have already recorded the resonance. To break it now would be to invite the exile of my entire house. I would be stripped of my rank, and you would be hunted down and flayed in the public square. Silas whistled low. So, we're stuck, like two ships with their docking clamps jammed in a debris field. You will be a shadow, Karys hissed, her face inches from his. You will stay in this spire. You will not speak to the clans. You will not touch the sacred relics, and you will most certainly not touch me. If you cross the line of this dwelling without my permission, I will forget the covenant and end you myself. Do you understand, gearhead? Perfectly, Silas said, his own temper beginning to flare. You want a ghost? Fine, I've been a ghost for a long time. It's what I'm good at. He turned his gaze to the room, looking for a place to collapse. In the far corner, away from the central fire pit that glowed with a soft blue flame, there was a pile of rough woven mats. He walked over and sat down, his movements stiff and pained. Karys watched him, her ears twitching with a strange, frustrated energy. She didn't offer him medicine. She didn't offer him food. She simply turned back to the balcony, her silhouette a sharp, lonely line against the violet sky. Silas reached into his tattered jumpsuit and pulled out a small, battered metal cylinder. It was his last remaining piece of tech, a micro-welder with a flickering power cell. He ran his thumb over the scratched casing, the familiar weight of it a small comfort in this alien nightmare. He looked at the back of the woman who was now by law his forever. He saw the way her shoulders were hunched, the way her silver tattoos were dimming as the sun set. She was a warrior who had lost her honor to a scavenger, and he was a scavenger who had lost his freedom to a spear. This is a real snafu, Silas whispered to himself, his eyes closing as the exhaustion finally won. Total system failure. He drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, the sound of the wind whistling through the obsidian walls sounding like the ghosts of the crew he had left behind. He didn't see Karys turn away from the balcony an hour later. He didn't see her walk over to him, her emerald eyes searching his sleeping face with a mixture of disgust and a haunting, silent curiosity. She looked at the broken, soot-stained fingers of his left hand, the ones that had caught her spear. She saw the raw, angry bruises forming on his shoulder. Slowly, almost as if she couldn't help herself, she reached out a hand, her fingers hovering just millimeters above his skin. The air between them crackled with a faint, static charge, the first whisper of the bond. Karys flinched back as if burned, her ears pinning back in shame. She retreated to her own side of the spire, the darkness swallowing her, leaving Silas Vane alone in the corner of a world that hated him, protected by a law he didn't believe in, and bound to a woman who wanted him dead. It was going to be along forever. The light of the twin suns, Solus and Vale, didn't so much rise as they did bleed through the obsidian shutters of the high Exarch spire. It was a harsh, oscillating violet glow that made the veins in Silas's eyelids pulse. He groaned, shifting on the thin, woven mats that had served as his bed for the past 6 hours. Every joint in his body felt like it had been packed with coarse sand and then hammered into place. His left hand, the one that had intercepted the star shard, was a swollen, blackened mess of agony. He cradled it against his chest, the rhythmic throb of his pulse sounding like a warning siren in the back of his skull. "This is a total snafu," Silas whispered, his voice a dry rasp. 100% certified foobar situation? He forced himself to sit up, his gaze sweeping the chamber. Karys was gone. The central fire pit was nothing but a bed of glowing blue embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the silver-etched histories on the walls. The air was cold, smelling of stale ozone, and the lingering, spicy musk of the woman who now owned his life by decree. He looked at the balcony, the jagged peaks of the Valoni's range cutting into the morning haze like the teeth of a cosmic predator. He needed water. He needed a medical kit. But more than anything, he needed to understand the ground beneath his feet. Silas reached into the hidden thigh pocket of his tattered flight suit and pulled out his micro-welder. It was a standard-issue Weyland-Yutani scavenger tool, dented and scarred from years of abuse. But it was more than just a torch. He had spent months modifying the internal sensor array to detect structural weaknesses in derelict hulls. He tapped the casing, the small green display flickering to life with a low, reassuring hum. "Let's see what kind of rock we're sitting on," he muttered. He swept the sensor across the floor. The readout didn't make sense. Usually obsidian was a stable volcanic glass, but the resonance coming from the spire's foundations was erratic. It wasn't just geological. There was a rhythmic, pulsing frequency buried deep in the mantle of Alawan Prime, something that looked less like tectonic activity and more like a heartbeat under pressure. He moved to the balcony, the wind whipping his dark hair across his face. Below, the city was waking up. Valshari warriors moved through the crystalline streets like purple shadows, their voices a distant, melodic hum. But Silas wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the dust. The violet silt that covered everything was shimmering. It wasn't just dirt. It was ionized mineral waste, suspended in the air by a massive electromagnetic charge building up in the planet's crust. This isn't just an atmosphere, Silas thought, his brow furrowing as he checked the readings. It's a localized static field. The whole damn planet is charging up like a giant capacitor. The heavy stone door of the sanctum slid open with a grinding sound. Karys entered, her stride long and aggressive. She was dressed in leather training gear, her white hair tied back in a severe braid. She carried a tray of dark, translucent fruit and a stone pitcher that steamed with a sharp, medicinal scent. She stopped when she saw him standing on the balcony, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the micro-welder in his hand. "What is that sorcery?" she demanded, her voice vibrating with instant suspicion. "It's a sensor," Silas said, not bothering to hide his frustration. "A tool. It tells me if the floor is going to fall out from under us, which, by the way, is a distinct possibility." Karys set the tray down on a stone plinth with a heavy thud. "The floor is the bone of our ancestors, Outworlder. It has stood for 10,000 cycles. Your little buzzing box knows nothing of the endurance of Alawan Prime." Silas stepped back inside, his boots clicking on the stone. "Your ancestors didn't have to deal with the fact that this planet is currently experiencing a massive biostatic surge. Look at your own skin, Karys. The silver lines, your tattoos, they're flaring, aren't they? It's not just emotion. You're picking up the charge from the ground." Karys went still, her fingers curling into fists. "Our sages call it the Song of the Shard. It is a time of cleansing, of spiritual renewal. The earth speaks to us through the resonance. It is not for a skag like you to interpret." "A skag?" Silas laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You've been listening to the guards too much. Listen, I've spent my life stripping down dead ships and mining asteroids that would kill a man for looking at them the wrong way. I know when a system is about to redline. Your Song of the Shard is just a geological pressure cooker. If that pressure doesn't find a vent, this whole spire is going to become a very tall, very expensive tomb." Karys moved so fast Silas didn't even see her blur. Before he could blink, she was in his space, her hand gripping the collar of his flight suit. She was strong, her muscles like tempered steel under that violet skin. The scent of her, jasmine and cold iron, flooded his senses, distracting him for a heartbeat. "You will hold your tongue," she hissed. "You are a guest of the Covenant, not a counselor. You are here because the law demands it, not because I value your scavenger's logic. Do not speak of our world as if it were a broken engine." She shoved him back, her emerald eyes flashing with a mix of anger and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Eat," she commanded, gesturing to the tray. "Then you will stay within these walls. I have business with the High Council. They are debating your status." "My status?" Silas straightened his suit, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What's to debate?" I caught the stick. "I'm the winner, right?" Karys looked away, her ears flattening slightly. "Vorg is calling for a reconsideration. He claims your catch was a trick of the stars, a mechanical deception. He wants the Covenant voided. If he succeeds, the guards won't be bowing to you anymore. They'll be measuring you for a shallow grave." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Vorg, the mountain of purple muscle from the arena. The kind of guy who didn't take losing well. Great, Silas thought. I've got a planet about to explode and a jilted warrior who wants to skin me alive. Just a standard Tuesday. Then help me, Silas said, his voice dropping all pretense of sarcasm. Let me show you what I'm seeing. If I can prove the song is a physical threat, maybe we can use that to shut Vorg up. I cannot take you to the council, Karys said, her voice tight. To show you to them now would be an admission that I cannot control my own bonded. You are a shadow, Silas Vane. Shadows do not speak. She turned and strode out of the room, the door grinding shut behind her, with a finality that felt like a prison sentence. Silas stood in the center of the silent room, his hand throbbing, his mind racing. He looked at the fruit on the tray, dark, bitter-looking things, and the steaming pitcher. He took a sip of the liquid. Nasty. It tasted like boiled pine needles and charcoal, but as it slid down his throat, a warmth spread through his chest, dulling the edge of his pain. He walked back to the balcony and looked out at the shimmering canyons in the distance. The electromagnetic readings on his welder were climbing. 140 millivolts. 160. The air was beginning to hum with a low-frequency vibration that set his teeth on edge. Karys was walking into a trap, and she was too proud to see it. She thought the world was singing to her, but it was really just screaming a warning. Silas looked at the micro-welder in his hand. He had enough power for about 12 hours of scanning. He had no weapons, no allies, and he was currently the most hated man on the planet. But he was a scav runner. He was the guy who could find a way out of a pressurized airlock with a piece of gum and a prayer. I'm not staying in this box, he whispered. Not while the whole deck is about to collapse. He spent the next 2 hours studying the door's locking mechanism. It was a gravity weight system, elegant but simple. He didn't need to hack it. He just needed to shift the center of mass. Using his micro-welder on a low-intensity beam, he heated the stone around the primary pivot point. As the mineral expanded, the balance shifted. With a sharp metallic click, the door slid open, just enough for a man to squeeze through. Silas stepped into the hallway, his movements light and cautious. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew how to move through shadows. He followed the sound of the rising hum, the vibration in the floor guiding him toward the lower levels of the spire. He needed to get to the foundations. He needed to find the source of the resonance before the song of the shard reached its crescendo. As he moved, he passed a window that looked out toward the sacred sites. He saw a procession of Valshari warriors, their silver tattoos glowing brightly in the purple noon. At the head of the line was Karys, her star shard held high, leading them toward the shimmering canyons for a ritual of stabilization. They're going to the epicenter, Silas realized, his blood turning to ice. They're going to pump their biostatic energy into a fault line that's already overcharged. It wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was a detonator. The shimmering canyons were a labyrinth of translucent quartz and razor-sharp obsidian, located 3 kilometers from the heart of the city. The air here was so thick with static that Silas's hair was literally standing on end, and every time his boots hit the ground, a tiny spark jumped between the soles and the rock. He moved through the jagged terrain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had managed to scrounge a few more tools from a maintenance locker near the spire's base, a length of reinforced polymer cable and a thermal induction coil. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The hum had become a roar. It was a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated in Silas's lungs, making it hard to focus. His micro-welder was screaming, the display flashing a bright, angry red. 250 millivolts. Critical saturation. He rounded a corner and saw them. The ritual site was a natural amphitheater of glowing violet crystal. Karys and 12 of her elite Exarchs were standing in a circle, their spears planted firmly in the ground. They were chanting, a low melodic drone that seemed to synchronize with the planet's vibration. Their tattoos were blindingly bright, silver light bleeding from their skin and into the spears, which acted as conduits, driving the energy deep into the crystalline floor. Silas skidded to a halt at the edge of the amphitheater. "Stop!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the resonance. He saw Vorg standing on a high ledge overlooking the circle. The big warrior wasn't chanting. He was watching Karys with a cold, expectant smile. He knew. He might not understand the science, but he knew that this ritual was different. He knew the earth was angry, and he was waiting for it to swallow his rival. "Karys!" Silas shouted again, lunging forward. He tripped over a protruding shard of quartz, the sharp edge slicing through the sleeve of his jumpsuit. He scrambled up, ignoring the sting. He reached the edge of the circle just as the ground began to shiver. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a ripple. The entire floor of the amphitheater flexed like the skin of a drum. Karys looked up, her face tight with the strain of the ritual. She saw Silas, and for a second, her emerald eyes filled with a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. "I told you to stay," she bellowed, her voice amplified by the static. "You defile this place. You're killing yourselves," Silas yelled back, pointing his welder at the ground. "Look at the readings. You're not stabilizing the earth. You're feeding the surge. It's going to blow, Karys. The whole canyon is a pressure valve, and you're plugging it up." Vorg's voice boomed from the ledge above. "The Outworlder brings his lies to our holiest ground. He fears the power of the shard. Do not break the circle, Exarchs. Prove your strength." The ground flexed again, harder this time. A massive crack erupted through the center of the quartz floor, a gout of glowing violet gas hissing into the air. One of the warriors screamed as the energy surged back up her spear, throwing her 20 meters across the amphitheater. The circle broke. The resonance, now unchecked and wildly unstable, began to tear the canyon apart. Huge blocks of obsidian began to shear off the walls, crashing into the arena. Karys tried to stabilize her stance, but the ground beneath her gave way. A massive pillar of crystal groaned and began to tilt, its shadow falling directly over her. She was trapped, her foot caught in a narrow fissure that had snapped shut like a vise. Karys, Silas didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He wasn't a warrior, but he was a man who knew how to bridge a gap. He sprinted across the buckling floor, dodging falling debris. The air was a chaotic swirl of violet gas and blinding sparks. He reached Karys just as the crystal pillar reached its tipping point. "Go!" she shouted at him, her face contorted in pain as she tugged at her trapped leg. "Leave me, Scavenger. Save your own miserable skin." "Not today," Silas grunted. He didn't try to pull her out. Brute force was for the Valshari, and it wasn't working. He grabbed his thermal induction coil and jammed it into the fissure next to her foot. He bypassed the safety limiters on his welder, slaving the power cell directly to the coil. "What are you doing?" she gasped, the shadow of the pillar looming over them. "Thermal shock," Silas muttered, his hands moving in a blur of practiced precision. "I'm going to flash heat the quartz. It'll expand and then shatter. Just hold your breath." He slammed the activation stud. The coil glowed a brilliant white. There was a sharp, high-pitched crack as the crystal fissure literally exploded outward. Karys stumbled back, her leg free, but the pillar was already falling. Silas grabbed the star shard she had dropped and jammed it into a narrow notch in the canyon wall, using it as a makeshift lever. He put his entire weight behind it, his boots skidding on the slick floor. The spear, made of gravity glass, bent but didn't break. It caught the edge of the falling pillar, slowing its descent for a fraction of a second. "Move!" Silas roared. Karys lunged toward him, grabbing his waist. He felt her strength as she threw both of them backward, just as the pillar slammed into the ground where they had been standing. The impact was deafening, a cloud of crystal shards and dust erupting into the air. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of escaping gas and the distant fading hum of the earth. The surge had found its vent. The violet gas was dissipating into the sky. The pressure finally equalized. Silas lay on his back, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the purple suns above. His flight suit was a total loss, shredded and burnt. His micro-welder was a melted hunk of plastic, but he was breathing. He felt a weight on his chest. Karys was kneeling over him, her hair a wild mess, her emerald eyes wide with a shock that transcended anything he had seen in the arena. She wasn't looking at him as a shadow or a skag. She was looking at him as if she were seeing a new species for the first time. "You," she started, her voice trembling. "You use the shard, not as a weapon, but as a tool." "It's just physics, Karys," Silas panted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Levers and pulleys. Science doesn't care about your rituals, it just cares about the load." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the raw, burnt skin of his shoulder. Her touch was no longer aggressive. It was gentle, almost reverent. The silver lines on her skin were pulsing with a soft, warm light, a steady resonance that matched his own heartbeat. "You saved me," she whispered. "You stayed when the earth was breaking. No Valshari would have done that. They would have died for honor. But you lived for me." Silas looked up at her, the jasmine scent of her skin filling the space between them. For the first time, the distance between the human scavenger and the alien warrior didn't feel like a light year. It felt like a heartbeat. "Yeah, well," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I told you, staying alive is my specialty." From the ledge above, a low snarl reminded them they weren't alone. Forg stood there, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at the shattered amphitheater, at the vent where the energy had escaped, and then at Karys and Silas huddled together on the ground. "The Outworlder has broken the shard," Vorg bellowed, his voice echoing through the ruined canyon. "He has destroyed our sacred site. This is not a rescue. It is a desecration." Karys stood up, her hand still resting on Silas's shoulder. She looked up at Vorg, and Silas saw the high Exarch return. But there was something else in her eyes now, a cold, analytical clarity that hadn't been there before. "He didn't break it, Vorg," she called out, her voice ringing with a new authority. "He understood it. He did what all our sages and warriors could not. He listened to the world, and he answered." She looked down at Silas and offered him her hand. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. Silas took it, letting her pull him to his feet. His legs were shaky, and his shoulder was on fire. But as he stood beside her in the wreckage of the canyon, he realized that the point of no return wasn't the arena. It was here. The law had tied them together, but this moment, this shared survival, had welded them. Vorg slammed his fist against the rock. "The council will hear of this." "You have chosen a weakling over your people, Karys." "Then let them hear," Karys replied, her grip on Silas's hand tightening. "Let them see that the strength of the Valshari is not the only power in the stars." As they walked out of the ruined canyon, Silas felt the eyes of the remaining Exarchs on him. They weren't bowing, but they weren't reaching for their blades either. They were watching him with a confused, budding respect, the kind of look a ground pounder gives a pilot who just landed a burning ship in a hurricane. He was still a scavenger. He was still an outsider. But as he looked at Karys, at the way the violet suns caught the white of her hair and the deep purple of her skin, Silas knew that the game had changed. "We've got a long walk back," he said, chancing a look at her, "and my boots are full of sand." Karys didn't smile, but her ears perked up in a way that he was starting to recognize as amusement. "Then you should have caught a smaller spear, Silas Vane." The scavenger laughed, a genuine warm sound that echoed off the obsidian walls. "Yeah," he said, "I'll keep that in mind for next time." But as they moved toward the city, Silas's mind was already scanning the horizon. The surge was over for now, but the readings he'd seen before his welder fried were haunting him. The planet wasn't just venting, it was preparing for something bigger, something that 1,000 spears and 1,000,000 rituals couldn't stop. He looked at Karys, her head held high, her hands still locked in his. "I'm going to need a lot more tools," he thought. The humanistic theme of the story began to solidify in the dust of the canyon. Silas had seen the danger of prejudice, how Karys's people were willing to die for a ritual they didn't understand, simply because it was their tradition. He had seen how their fear of his scavenger's logic had almost cost them everything. But he had also seen the first crack in that wall. He had seen a warrior choose to trust the unknown, to look past the grease and the tattered suit to see the mind beneath. They weren't just bonded by law anymore. They were bonded by the truth that survival didn't belong to the strongest, but to those who were brave enough to listen to the world, even when it spoke in a language they didn't know. The journey was just beginning, and the stars were watching. The trek back from the shimmering canyons was not the triumphant return of a hero. It was a funeral march through a city that didn't know it was dying. Silas Vane walked 3 paces behind Karys, his boots heavy with the violet silt of Eloan Prime. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been shredded and stitched back together with hot wire. His left arm was strapped to his chest in a makeshift sling he had fashioned from a piece of Karys's leather gear, and his head throbbed with the rhythmic, dull beat of a concussion. They passed through the lower wards where the common Valshari lived in homes carved into the roots of the petrified trees. Usually these streets were vibrant, filled with the melodic chatter of the people and the soft glow of their bioluminescent gardens. But today there was only a chilling, hollow silence. The warriors they passed did not offer the traditional salute of the Star Shard. They simply stood, their purple skin looking sallow in the twilight of the twin suns, their emerald eyes fixed on Silas with a cold, sharpening hunger. "Check your six," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the whistling wind. "We've got a lot of eyes on us, Karys, and none of them look friendly." Karys did not turn. Her back was a ramrod straight line of defiance, but Silas could see the slight tremor in her white filament hair. Her silver tattoos were dim, flickering like a dying lantern. "They are afraid, Silas. Fear is a poison that tastes like justice to the ignorant. They see the canyon in ruins, and they see you standing in the wreckage. To them, you are the catalyst of the disaster, not the shield." "Yeah, well, I've been the scapegoat before," Silas muttered, his hand tightening around the strap of his sling. "It's a real thankless gig, but Vorg is going to use this. He's already up there, whispering in the Elder's ears about how the Outworlder broke the world." "Let him whisper," Karys replied, though her voice lacked its usual vibrance. "The truth is a mountain. It does not move for the wind of a liar." As they reached the base of the obsidian spire, a group of young warriors blocked the path. They were barely 20 years old, their tattoos fresh and bright, their spears leveled at Silas's chest. At their center stood Joran, a subordinate who had once served under Karys. "The elders have summoned the High Exarch," Joran said, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and bravado. "But the Scavenger is to be taken to the pits. He is no longer under the protection of the Covenant until the desecration is answered." Karys stepped forward, her hand moving to the hilt of her short blade. The resonance from her skin flared into a sudden, blinding white. "The Covenant is not a garment to be cast off when the wind turns cold, Joran. He is my bonded. If you wish to take him to the pits, you must first walk over my corpse." The young warriors hesitated. Even in her weakened state, Karys was a legend. She was the one who had hunted the great Vorak in the deep caves, the one who had held the northern pass for 3 days against the raiders. "Stand down," Silas said, stepping beside her. He looked at Joran, his gaze weary but sharp. "Listen, kid, you take me to the pits, and you lose the only guy who knows why the air in this city is starting to taste like burnt copper. Your planet is redlining. If you want to spend your last hours watching me rot in a hole, that's your call. But I'd suggest you let us pass so we can actually fix this snafu." Joran blinked, his spear wavering. The word snafu was alien to him, but the clinical, cold certainty in Silas's voice was universal. It was the tone of a man who had seen the end of things and knew how to count the seconds. "Let them pass," a booming voice commanded from above. Vorg stood on the landing of the spire, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the group. He looked down at them with a look of predatory triumph. "Let the High Exarch bring her shadow to the council. Let the elders see the things she has chosen over her people. The law demands a hearing, and the law shall have its fill." The young warriors stepped aside, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering resentment. Karys led Silas up the winding obsidian stairs, her hand gripping his uninjured arm. The touch was firm, a silent anchor in a world that was rapidly drifting toward chaos. The council chamber was a vast circular room at the very apex of the spire. The ceiling was open to the sky, allowing the violet light of the twin suns to wash over the 7 elders who sat on high, crystalline thrones. These were the oldest of the Valshari, their skin almost translucent, their tattoos faded to a ghostly gray. They were the keepers of the law, the final arbiters of the Kyrath Covenant. Vorg stood in the center of the room, his warp spear planted firmly in the stone. He had already begun his testimony. "And as the pillars fell, the Outworlder laughed," Vorg was saying, his voice a low, theatrical rumble. "He used his metal sorcery to crack the sacred quartz. He turned the song of the shard into a scream of agony. Karys, blinded by the bond, stood by and watched as he desecrated the heart of our world." Karys strode into the center of the circle, pulling Silas with her. "Vorg tells a tale for children, elders. He speaks of laughter and sorcery because he cannot speak of physics. He was on the ledge. He saw the surge. He saw that the ritual was failing because the earth was already saturated. The head elder, a male whose name was Thalor, leaned forward. His eyes were milky with age, but they held a terrifying depth of focus. Karys, High Exarch of the Valonis, you stand accused of allowing a non-believer to interfere with the rite of stabilization. The shimmering canyons are shattered. The resonance is silenced. How do you answer? I answer with my life, Karys said, her voice ringing off the obsidian walls. Silas Vane did not desecrate the canyon. He saved it from a total collapse. He freed me from the fissure and vented the pressure that would have leveled the city. He is not a shadow. He is a partner. A murmur of disbelief swept through the chamber. To the Valshari, the idea of a scavenger being a partner was like suggesting a parasite was a limb. A partner? Vorg sneered, taking a step toward them. He is a scag, a bottom feeder from a race that burns their own worlds for fuel. What does he know of our Earth? What does he know of the Shard? I know it's not a god, Silas said, his voice cutting through Vorg's bluster. He stepped forward, ignoring Karys's warning tug. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged fragment of rock he had picked up in the canyon. It wasn't violet or translucent. It was a matte, oily black, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. What is that? Thalor asked, his brow furrowing. This is the reason your planet is dying, Silas said. He held the black shard up for all to see. I found this at the base of the fallen pillar. It's not obsidian, and it's not quartz. It's a depleted thorium isotope casing. It's ancient, maybe 10,000 years old. It didn't come from your ancestors, and it didn't come from me. He walked toward the elders' thrones, his boots clicking in the sudden silence. Someone was here a long time ago. Before your clans, before your laws, they were mining Alawan Prime for its core stability. They left their waste buried deep in the mantle, encased in these shards. But the casings are failing. The song you hear? That's the sound of ancient reactors leaking radiation and heat into your crust. The ritual you perform? You're just feeding more energy into a system that's already melting down. Vorg laughed, but there was a frantic edge to it. Lies! He invents stories to hide his crime. There were no others before us. We are the firstborn of the twin sons. Check your ego, Vorg, Silas snapped. I've seen this on a dozen worlds. You think you're special? You're just the people living on top of an old scrap heap, and right now the heap is about to catch fire. Thalor looked at the black shard, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. He pulled back before his skin met the surface, his tattoos flaring a nervous yellow. If what you say is true, Outworlder, then our entire history is a shadow. Our rituals are a vanity. It doesn't matter what your history is, Silas said, his voice softening. What matters is the next 48 hours. The surge in the canyon was just the pilot light. The main burner is under this city. If we don't find a way to vent the primary reactor, there won't be anyone left to argue about honor. Vorg stepped in front of Silas, his massive hand closing around the human's throat. He lifted him off the ground with a grunt of effort. I will hear no more. He poisons our minds as he poisons our land. Elders, I demand the right of correction. I will silence this ghost and reclaim the honor of our clan. Karys was on him in an instant, her blade pressed against Vorg's ribs. Drop him, Vorg, now. The tension in the room was a physical weight. The guards at the doors had their spears leveled. The elders looked on in frozen horror. The prejudice that had simmered for weeks was finally boiling over. To the Valshari, Silas was the ultimate other, a reminder that their world was not theirs alone, that their gods were just failing machines, and that their strength was useless against the cold logic of the stars. Enough! Thalor's voice was a crack of thunder. Vorg hesitated, then dropped Silas. The human collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his hand going to his bruised neck. The council will deliberate, Thalor said, his voice weary. The scavenger will be returned to the spire under heavy guard. Karys, you will remain here. We must decide if the covenant still holds in the face of such revelation. You can't be serious, Silas wheezed, looking up from the floor. We don't have time for a committee meeting. The ground is literally vibrating under your thrones. Take him, Thalor commanded. As the guards grabbed Silas, he looked at Karys. She was standing in the center of the room surrounded by her peers, looking more alone than he had ever seen her. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting second, he saw a silent plea. "Don't give up on us." "I'm a scavenger, remember?" Silas whispered as they dragged him out. "I never leave anything behind." But as the heavy obsidian doors closed, Silas felt the first real pang of fear. He had challenged their beliefs, exposed their history as a lie, and insulted their greatest warrior. He had tried to help them by showing them the truth, but he had forgotten one simple rule of the universe. People would rather burn in a familiar lie than be saved by a cold truth they didn't understand. The humanistic cost of his honesty was becoming clear. By stripping away their illusions, he had stripped away their hope. And a people without hope were a people who looked for someone to blame. The silence of the obsidian spire was no longer peaceful. It was thick and suffocating, like the air in a tomb. Silas sat in the corner of his room, his back against the cold stone, watching the shadows of the twin suns crawl across the floor. He had been locked away for 12 hours. No food, no water, and his micro-welder had been confiscated. But he didn't need a sensor to know things were getting worse. He could see it on his own skin. A fine gray dust was settling on his arms. Not the violet silt from the canyon, but something grittier, something that seemed to itch with a low-grade electrical burn. It was the gray fade, the physical manifestation of the thorium leakage. On a human, it was a nuisance. On the Valshari, whose biology was tied to the planet's biostatic field, it would be a death sentence. The door groaned open. It wasn't the guards. It was Karys. She looked like she had aged 100 years in a single night. Her violet skin was pale, and the gray fade was already beginning to cloud the silver lines of her tattoos. She walked into the room with a halting, unsteady gait, her star shard held like a walking stick rather than a weapon. "Karys," Silas said, scrambling to his feet. He moved toward her, but stopped when she raised a hand. "The council has made its decision," she said, her voice a hollow echo of its former self. "Vorg has been granted the right of challenge. He will face you at dawn in the arena. If you win, the council will listen to your scavenger logic. If he wins, he will lead the clans in a final massive rite of stabilization to cleanse the world." "A final rite?" Silas's blood ran cold. "That's suicide. If they dump that much energy into the crust now, it'll trigger a chain reaction. The whole continent will go up in a thorium flare." "They do not believe you, Silas," Karys said, finally letting her head hang. "They chose the familiar path. They chose to die with honor rather than live with the shame of being scavengers on an old scrap heap." She looked up at him, and he saw the tears in her emerald eyes, small, translucent beads of liquid light. "Vorg has spent the night telling the people that the sickness, the gray fade, is your doing. He says your presence has tainted the song. They are screaming for your blood, Silas. Even the children." Silas felt a surge of cold, sharp anger. "Of course they are. It's easier to kill one man than it is to admit your whole world is a lie. That's the oldest story in the galaxy." He walked over to her, ignoring her earlier warning. He took her hands in his. Her skin was cold, the gray fade feeling like ash against his palms. "Listen to me. I'm not going to let them kill me, and I'm sure as hell not going to let them kill you. We're going to fix this, but I need my tools." "They were destroyed," Karys whispered. "Vorg smashed your metal box in front of the council." "He smashed the casing," Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. "But the sensor core is reinforced. It's built to survive a shipboard explosion. He probably threw it in the scrap pile at the base of the spire. If I can get to it, I can retune the induction coil I stole from the maintenance locker. I can create a localized dampening field." "And then what?" "And then we go to the reactor," Silas said. "Not the canyon. The primary vent is under the Great Temple. We seal the leak, we vent the gas into the upper atmosphere where it can disperse, and we buy this world another 1,000 years." Karys looked at him, her brow furrowed. "You speak of our temple as if it were a factory. You speak of our song as if it were gas. Do you have any idea what you are asking me to do? To help you desecrate the holiest place on Elowen Prime?" "I'm asking you to choose," Silas said, his voice hard. "Do you want to be a high exarch of a graveyard, Or do you want to be a partner to a man who can save your people? Honor won't breathe for you when the air turns to poison, Karys. Tradition won't feed your children. Only the truth can do that. Karys pulled her hands away, pacing the room like a caged predator. Her ears were twitching, picking up the frantic, dissonant hum of the planet below. The prejudice is too deep, Silas. Even if we succeed, the people will never forgive us. We will be exiles. Ghosts. I've been a ghost my whole life, Silas said softly. It's not so bad. You get to go where you want, and you don't have to answer to anyone's laws but your own. He stepped toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. Karys, look at me. I was a coward once. I left a whole crew behind on a burning station because I was afraid I couldn't save them. I've spent 10 years running from that fear, trying to pretend I was just a scavenger, just a guy looking for parts. But I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being a ghost. I want to stand for something. Let me stand with you. The humanistic weight of his confession hit the air like a physical force. For the first time, Silas wasn't just a technician or a victim of circumstances. He was a man admitting his flaws, offering his growth as a bridge. He was showing her that courage wasn't the absence of fear or the blind following of tradition. It was the willingness to be hated for doing what was right. Karys stopped her pacing. She looked at him for a long, silent minute, the silver lines on her skin flickering as she fought her internal battle. The High Exarch, the warrior of tradition, was dying. Something else was taking her place. The scrap pile is guarded, she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its steel. Vorg has his best men there to ensure nothing is recovered. Then we don't go as warriors, Silas said. We go as ghosts. The escape from the spire was a desperate, shadow-filled affair. Karys knew every secret passage, every hidden vent that the Valshari had carved into the stone over the centuries. They moved through the darkness, their breathing the only sound in the silent corridors. As they reached the lower levels, they saw the first victims of the Grey Fade. In the medical wards, dozens of Valshari lay on mats, their skin covered in the ashen dust. Their breathing was labored, a wet, rattling sound that made Silas's stomach turn. A young mother sat by her child, her hands moving in a futile, rhythmic prayer over the boy's gray chest. She looked up as Karys and Silas passed, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Karys paused, her hand going to her heart. They are dying, Silas. My people are dying. Then let's go get those tools, Silas said, his voice tight. They reached the scrapyard behind the spire. It was a chaotic mound of broken stone, rusted metal from ancient wrecks, and the discarded remnants of 1,000 years of Valshari life. Vorg's guards were there, 4 of them, sitting around a blue fire pit, their spears leaning against a pile of obsidian. I will distract them, Karys whispered. You find your device. Wait, Silas said, grabbing her arm. Don't kill them. They're just doing their jobs. They don't know any better. Karys looked at him, her eyes softening. You are a strange male, Silas Vane. You would spare those who want you dead. It's called not being a jerk, Silas said. Try it sometime. It's good for the soul. Karys vanished into the shadows, a purple blur of motion. A moment later, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the yard, a pile of heavy stone blocks collapsing. The guards shouted and ran toward the sound, their spears leveled. Silas lunged for the scrap pile. He dug through the debris, his fingers bleeding as he pushed aside jagged pieces of metal. Come on, he hissed. He saw it, a glint of reinforced titanium, the sensor core of his micro-welder. It was cracked, the casing dented, but when he pressed the emergency reset, a tiny, flickering green light appeared on the side. Gotcha, he whispered. He scrambled back into the shadows just as the guards returned. They were grumbling, looking around the yard with renewed suspicion. Did you hear that? One of them asked, his ears perking up. Sounded like someone was digging. It's just the wind, another replied, though he looked uneasy. The Grey Fade is making us jumpy. Let's get back to the fire. Silas made it back to the rendezvous point, his heart hammering in his chest. Karys appeared out of the darkness, her chest heaving. Did you find it? She asked. Yeah, Silas said, holding up the core. It's alive, barely, but it's enough to find the reactor's primary seal. Now we just have to get into the Great Temple without being seen by half the city. The temple is not guarded by warriors, Karys said, her voice turning grim. It is guarded by the elders, and they never sleep. They moved through the city toward the Great Temple, a massive, pyramid-shaped structure of white quartz that stood at the very center of the Veloni Valley. The air here was vibrating so violently that Silas could feel his teeth rattling in his gums. The gray fade was everywhere now, a thick, choking fog that clung to the buildings and the trees. As they reached the base of the temple, they saw the crowds. Thousands of Valshari had gathered in the plaza, their voices raised in a desperate, mournful chant. They were waiting for dawn, waiting for the rite of stabilization. At the center of the crowd, on a high platform, stood Vorg. He was bare-chested, his ritual battle scars glowing with a fierce, unstable light. He held a massive warhammer, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "He's whipping them into a frenzy," Silas whispered, peering around a stone pillar. "He's telling them that the only way to save the world is to burn the poison out. And he means me." "And me," Karys added, her hand settling on the hilt of her blade. "I am no longer their high exarch. I am the woman who brought the plague into their house." She looked at the temple, the quartz walls shimmering with the buildup of electromagnetic energy. "If we go in there, Silas, there is no coming back. We will be branded as the greatest traitors in our history. Even if we save them, they will hunt us to the ends of Alolan Prime." Silas looked at the gray-covered children in the plaza, at the weeping mothers, at the dying world around him. He thought about the station he had left behind, the faces of his crew as the airlock closed. He thought about the 10 years he had spent as a ghost, a scavenger of lives that weren't his. He looked at Karys. The silver lines on her skin were almost gone, replaced by the dull, ashen gray of the fade. But her eyes were still emerald. They were still bright. They were still hers. "I'm done with running, Karys," Silas said, his voice clear and steady. "I'd rather be a traitor to a city than a traitor to my own heart. Let's go fix this world." The turning point was no longer a moment in time. It was a choice in the dark. The prejudice of a civilization was a powerful force, a wall of stone and tradition. But Silas Vane and Karys were no longer bound by that wall. They were bound by something stronger, a shared recognition of the cost of staying silent, and the courage to be the villains of a story if it meant the story could continue. As they slipped into the secret entrance of the Great Temple, the first light of Solis and Vale began to touch the horizon. The dawn of the challenge had arrived, but the real fight was happening deep beneath the white quartz, where a scavenger and a warrior were about to take on a 10,000-year-old ghost. The gray fade was thickening, the resonance was screaming, and the world was holding its breath. "Check your six, Karys," Silas whispered as they descended into the heart of the machine. "I have you, Silas," she replied. "Always." The humanistic theme of the story was being tested to its breaking point. Silas had to face the reality that being a hero often meant being hated. He had to accept that his growth, from a coward who ran to a man who stayed, came with a price that could never be repaid in credits or honor. And Karys had to face the ultimate challenge of her character. Could she love a world enough to let it hate her? The lesson was taking root in the darkness. True courage isn't the loud roar of the arena. It's the quiet, steady breath of two people doing what is necessary when everyone else is screaming for their destruction. The reactor was waiting, and so was the end of the world. The interior of the Great Temple was a cathedral of forgotten physics. As Silas and Karys descended past the public prayer halls, the ornate white quartz gave way to something far older and infinitely more utilitarian. The walls here were not carved. They were cast from a seamless, dull gray alloy that felt unnervingly warm to the touch. Glowing conduits, which the Valshari had for centuries adorned with silk ribbons and offerings of dried flowers, were actually high-voltage plasma lines pulsing with a jagged, sickly yellow light. Silas adjusted his grip on the cracked sensor core. The device was chirping a frantic, high-pitched warning that made his skin crawl. "We're deep in the gut of it now," he whispered, his voice echoing flatly against the metal. "This isn't a temple, Karys. It's a Type 2 planetary stabilization plant. Or it was, before the previous tenants decided to use the basement as a toxic waste dump." Karys walked beside him, her star shard held low. She looked at the humming machinery with a mixture of awe and profound, soul-deep grief. To her, every step was a desecration. She passed a massive circular vent that had been draped in the tapestry of the first stars, a sacred relic depicting the birth of their race. Silas didn't see a relic. He saw a primary coolant intake that had been choked by centuries of dust and decorative fabric. My people have knelt before these machines for 10,000 generations, she said, her voice barely a breath. We sang to the cooling fans. We gave thanks to the pressure valves. We thought the hum was the voice of the divine, Silas. We thought it was love. It's just maintenance, Karys, Silas said, though he didn't say it unkindly. He stopped in front of a heavy bulkhead door that was fused shut by layers of oxidized thorium. And right now the maintenance is 5,000 years overdue. The song is the sound of a reactor core trying to vent through a straw. If we don't clear these intakes and manual override the primary seal, the divine is going to turn this valley into a glass bowl. He knelt by the door, his fingers trembling as he tried to interface the sensor core with a corroded access panel. The gray fade was thicker down here, a visible mist that tasted like tin foil and old batteries. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that brought a smear of gray-flecked blood to his palm. Check your 6, Silas grunted, nodding toward the dark corridor behind them. Vorg isn't going to sit on that platform forever. He knows we're down here. He's probably got his best dust eaters coming for us as we speak. The elders believe the lower depths are cursed, Karys replied, though she didn't move from his side. She reached out, her fingers tracing a line of ancient, glowing text on the wall, binary code that her culture had interpreted as the language of angels. They will not come easily, but Vorg does not fear curses. He only fears losing the world he understands. She looked at Silas, her emerald eyes searching his tired, sweat-streaked face. You speak of these things with such coldness, Silas Vane, as if the world is nothing but a collection of gears and levers. Do you feel nothing for the beauty of the lie we lived? Silas stopped working for a second. He looked up at her, the yellow plasma light reflecting in his dark eyes. I've seen a lot of beautiful lies, Karys. I've seen stations where the air recyclers were failing, but the captain kept the holographic gardens running so the crew wouldn't panic. They died smelling roses, but they still died. I'd rather live in a cold, ugly truth than perish in a warm, pretty dream. That's what being a scavenger teaches you. You don't look at the paint, you look at the hull. He turned back to the panel, his voice dropping an octave. But yeah, I get it. It sucks to find out your gods are just leaky hardware. I'm sorry, Karys. I really am. A sharp metallic click echoed through the chamber. The bulkhead door groaned, its ancient magnetic seals finally yielding to Silas's persistent hacking. It slid open an inch, releasing a gust of hot, ionized air that smelled of ozone and scorched earth. Bingo, Silas whispered. We're in. They stepped into the central core, a massive, hollow cylinder that dropped away into a bottomless pit of swirling violet energy. In the center of the pit, suspended by a web of humming gravity pylons, was the shard. It wasn't a spear or a crystal. It was a 3-story-tall containment vessel, pulsating with a violent, unstable light. It looked like a heart made of lightning, trapped in a cage of rusted iron. The roar here was absolute. It wasn't a hum anymore. It was a physical force that vibrated in Silas's teeth and made his vision blur. The gray fade was so thick it looked like snow, swirling in the updraft of the reactor's heat. That's it, Silas shouted over the noise, pointing to a control console at the edge of the pit. The primary override. If I can get that open, I can vent the pressure into the upper atmospheric stacks. It'll kill the song, but it'll save the city. And the shard? Karys asked, staring at the pulsating heart. What happens to the source of our power? It'll go cold, Karys, Silas said, his expression grim. The lights will go out. The tattoos will fade. Your people will have to learn how to live without the planet feeding them energy. They'll have to build, to invent, to be like us. Karys stood at the edge of the abyss, the white filament of her hair whipped by the thermal winds. She looked at the shard, then at her own hands, where the silver lines were already dying. The prejudice she had been raised with, the belief that the Valshari were a superior, divinely connected race, was crumbling as fast as the quartz walls above them. We will be weak, she murmured. No, Silas said, stepping beside her. He took her hand, his fingers locking with hers. You'll just be human. And believe me, that's plenty of work all on its own. The moment was shattered by a booming roar from the doorway. Vorg stood there, flanked by 6 of his most loyal warriors. His massive war hammer was glowing with a fierce, sickly violet light, fueled by the intense ambient energy of the core. His eyes were wild, his skin covered in a thick layer of gray fade that he seemed to ignore in his zealotry. Desecrators! Vorg bellowed, his voice carrying even over the roar of the reactor. I knew the Scavenger would lead you to the heart. You seek to steal the soul of the Valshari. You seek to turn our gods into scrap. Karys stepped in front of Silas, her star shard snapping to her shoulder. The soul is already burning, Vorg. Look at the core. It is failing. If we do not vent the pressure, there will be no Valshari left to worship anything. Lies of a broken Exarch, Vorg charged, his hammer swinging in a massive, lumbering arc. Karys met him halfway, the 2 warriors clashing in a spray of sparks and ionized dust. The 6 other warriors moved to encircle Silas, their spears leveled. Check your 6, Silas, Karys screamed as she parried a blow that would have shattered a stone pillar. Silas lunged for the console. He didn't have a weapon, but he had 1,000 hours of experience in hostile environments. As the first warrior thrust his spear, Silas didn't retreat. He dove under the strike, grabbing a handful of the gray thorium dust from the floor and throwing it into the warrior's eyes. The Valshari screamed, the radioactive silt burning his sensitive emerald eyes. Silas didn't stop to gloat. He reached into his belt and pulled out the thermal induction coil. He didn't use it to cut. He jammed it into a nearby power conduit. Cover your ears, Silas yelled. He triggered a localized feedback loop. A massive, high-frequency squeal erupted from the conduit, a sound so sharp it shattered the decorative quartz panels on the walls. The Valshari, whose hearing was far more sensitive than a human's, collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads in agony. Silas reached the console. It was a nightmare of dead circuits and alien interfaces. He smashed the decorative silk away, revealing a row of manual levers and a small, flickering screen. Come on, you old bucket of bolts, Silas hissed, his fingers flying across the controls. Talk to me. Above him, the battle between Karys and Vorg was a desperate primal dance. Karys was faster, her movements a blur of violet grace. But Vorg was fueled by a fanatic strength in the proximity of the core. He swung his hammer again and again, each impact cracking the floor beneath him. You are nothing without the shard, Vorg roared, his hammer catching Karys in the ribs and sending her skidding across the metal floor. You are a slave to a hairless runt, a traitor to your blood. Karys coughed, a spray of violet blood hitting the floor. She looked at Silas, who was struggling with a rusted lever, his face pale and slick with sweat. She looked at the shard, the heart of her world, which was now pulsing with a terrifying, rhythmic thrum, the sound of a bomb about to go off. She realized then that Vorg was right about one thing. She was no longer the high exarch of the old world. She was something new, something that the old laws couldn't contain. She stood up, her ears flat against her skull, her emerald eyes burning with a light that didn't come from the reactor. My blood is my own, Vorg, and it says we live. She lunged not at Vorg, but at the gravity pylon holding the shard in place. Silas, now! Silas threw his entire weight against the primary lever. For a second, it didn't move. The rust of 5,000 years held fast. He screamed, his muscles straining, his shoulder threatening to pop out of its socket. He thought of the crew he had lost, the ghosts he carried. He thought of Karys. Move, you piece of junk! With a scream of protesting metal, the lever gave way. Deep within the temple, a series of massive, ancient valves groaned open. A pillar of white-hot thorium gas erupted from the core, channeled into the atmospheric vents Silas had cleared. The roar of the reactor changed from a scream to a long, low sigh, the sound of a dying beast finally finding rest. The shard began to dim. The violet light in the pit faded to a dull, pulsing amber. Above them, in the city, the lights began to flicker and die. The song of the shard was over. Vorg stood frozen, his hammer falling from his hands. He looked at the dimming core, his face a mask of absolute soul-shattering horror. "What have you done?" he whispered. "You have killed the world." "No," Karys said, stepping toward him, her spear lowered. "I've given us a tomorrow, Vorg. It's just going to be a lot darker than you're used to." The 5 remaining warriors, their ears still ringing, looked from Vorg to the cooling reactor. They looked at the gray fade, which was already starting to settle as the static charge dissipated. They looked at the human who was slumped over the console, his chest heaving, his hands still locked on the lever that had saved them all. The prejudice didn't vanish in an instant. It was still there, in the way they kept their distance, in the way they gripped their spears. But as the silence of the core stretched out, a new reality began to sink in. The Scavenger had been right. Their gods were gone, but they were still breathing. The humanistic theme had reached its first climax. The truth had set them free, but the freedom was cold, hard, and frightening. Silas had bridged the gap not with words, but with a lever, and the willingness to be the one who broke the dream. "Silas," Karys whispered, walking over to him. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a tired grin on his face. "Check your 6, Karys. I think the power bill just came due." The silence that followed the venting of the core was more terrifying than the roar had ever been. It was the silence of a heartbeat that had stopped. In the plaza above, the chanting had ceased, replaced by a low, communal moan of confusion and fear. The bioluminescent moss that lined the temple walls began to wither, its light fading from a vibrant violet to a dull, sickly brown. Silas sat on the floor of the core chamber, his back against the cooling console. He was covered in gray dust, his flight suit was a charred ruin, and his left hand was a numb, useless weight. But he was alive, and for a scavenger, that was the only metric that mattered. Karys knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his injured shoulder. The silver lines on her skin were nearly invisible now, leaving her violet skin looking flat and strangely vulnerable. Without the ambient energy of the shard, the Valshari looked less like gods and more like people, fragile, tired, and very, very mortal. "It is gone," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dim amber heart of the reactor. "The light of my ancestors. I can no longer feel the song, Silas. It is as if I have gone deaf in my soul." Silas reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm, a simple biological heat that had nothing to do with radiation or static. "That's just the silence, Karys. You'll get used to it. It's where most of the universe lives. It's where you start to hear your own voice instead of the one the machines were feeding you." She looked at him, her emerald eyes wet with tears. "Is this what it's like for you? All the time? This emptiness?" "It's not empty," Silas said, pulling her a little closer. "It's just quiet. It means you have to work for what you want. It means your choices actually matter, because there isn't a divine resonance to fix your mistakes for you. It's scary as hell, I know, but it's real." A movement across the chamber reminded them that the battle wasn't entirely over. Vorg was standing by the bulkhead, his massive frame trembling. He wasn't reaching for his hammer. He was looking at his hands, watching the gray fade settle into the pores of his skin. Without the static charge to repel the dust, the thorium silt was clinging to him like a shroud. "The clans will tear you apart," Vorg said, his voice a cracked whisper. "When they realize what you have taken, they will burn this spire to the ground with you inside it." "Then they'll be doing it in the dark," Silas snapped, his voice gaining a bit of its old edge. "Listen to me, Vorg. You can spend the rest of your life crying over a broken battery, or you can go up there and tell your people that the sickness is going to stop. Tell them the fate is settling. Tell them that for the first time in 10,000 years, they're not living on a ticking time bomb." Vorg looked at Silas, a flicker of his old hatred sparking in his eyes. "You think you have won, Scavenger? You think because you saved our bodies, we will thank you for killing our spirit?" "I don't want your thanks, Vorg," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I want you to move. I want you to take your warriors and start clearing the vents in the lower wards. Because if you don't, the gas that's already in the pipes is going to settle in the lungs of those kids I saw in the plaza. You want to be a hero? Go be a janitor. That's where the real work is." Vorg stared at him for a long minute. The silence of the room was heavy with the weight of two cultures clashing. one built on the pride of strength and tradition, the other on the gritty, unglamorous logic of survival. Finally, Vorg turned to his warriors. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his defeat finally crushing his spirit. "Go," he commanded. "Do as the Outworlder says. Clear the vents." The warriors hesitated, then bowed their heads to Karys, not as their high Exarch, but as a survivor, and filed out of the chamber. Vorg followed them, his footsteps heavy and hollow on the metal floor. Karys let out a long, shuddering breath. "He will not forgive you, Silas. He will wait for his moment." "Let him wait," Silas said, leaning his head back against the stone. "I've got a lot of experience with guys who wait. Usually by the time they're ready to move, I've already moved the goalposts." He looked at Karys, seeing the exhaustion in her face. "How are you holding up? Without the planetary Wi-Fi?" Karys touched her forehead, where the tribal symbol was now a dull, dark gray. "I feel heavy. My limbs feel like they are made of stone. The world feels slow, Silas. Everything is so slow." "That's just gravity, honey," Silas said with a weak laugh. "Welcome to the club. It's a bitch, but it keeps your feet on the ground." They sat together in the dim amber glow of the reactor for a long time. Silas used the last of his strength to perform a clinical assessment of his injuries. His shoulder was definitely dislocated, and he had at least 3 broken ribs. His left hand was likely permanently damaged. But as he looked at Karys, he realized that the pain was a grounding force. It was proof that he was still here, proof that he hadn't run. "I have a confession to make," Silas said, his voice hushed in the quiet of the temple. Karys turned to him, her ears perking up slightly. "Another one, Silas Vane? You are a man of many secrets. When I was on that station, the one I told you about, I didn't just run because I was scared," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the ceiling. "I ran because I didn't think they were worth saving. They were just scrapheads, addicts, and lowlifes. I thought, why should I die for people who don't matter? I judged them, Karys. I decided their lives were worth less than mine." He looked at her, his emerald eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "I did exactly what your people did to me. I looked at the surface and decided there was nothing underneath worth the risk. I was the one who was blind." Karys reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers cool and steady. "And now? Do you still think we are worth nothing, Scavenger?" Silas shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the gray dust on his face. "You're the most expensive thing I've ever found, Karys, and I'm not just talking about the Star Shard." The humanistic theme was now the heart of the action. Silas's transformation was complete, not because he had become a warrior, but because he had finally stopped being a judge. He had realized that the prejudice he had fought on Elowen Prime was a mirror of the one he had carried in his own heart. By saving the Valshari, he had finally saved the crew he had left behind 10 years ago. He had chosen to see the value in the broken, the alien, and the worthless. Karys leaned her forehead against his. It was the deepest gesture of Valshari respect, a soul bond that didn't need the resonance of the shard to be felt. "We are both ghosts now, Silas, but at least we are together in the dark." "Check your 6, Karys," Silas whispered, closing his eyes as the exhaustion finally started to pull him under. "I think the dark is where the best stories start." But the dark was not yet complete. As they began the long climb back to the surface, they were met not by blades, but by a wall of silent, staring faces. The people of Velones had gathered in the lower corridors of the temple, huddled together in the flickering emergency light of the dying moss. They were covered in gray fade, their eyes wide with terror and confusion. They saw Karys, their high exarch, walking with a limp, her white hair stained with soot. And they saw the human, the scavenger, supporting her, his arm around her waist, his body a broken roadmap of sacrifice. A single elderly woman stepped forward. She was a healer from the lower wards, her hands gnarled and gray. She looked at Silas, her gaze lingering on the burnt, mangled flesh of his left hand. She didn't speak. She didn't bow. She simply reached out and placed a small, cool leaf, a medicinal herb used for centuries to treat radiation burns, into his good hand. It was a tiny gesture, a fraction of a second in a 10,000-year history, but it was the first time a Valshari had given a human something that wasn't a death sentence. "The song is over," the woman whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "But the breathing continues." Silas looked at the leaf, then at the woman. He felt a lump in his throat that had nothing to do with thorium gas. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracking. "The breathing continues. That's the important part." As they moved through the crowd, the sea of purple shadows parted for them. There was no cheering. There was no applause. There was only the heavy, shared weight of a people who had just been born into a cold, dark world. The prejudice wasn't gone. It would take generations to unlearn the arrogance of the shard. It would take years of hunger, cold, and hard labor to build a world that didn't rely on ancient reactors. But as Silas and Karys stepped out into the plaza, into the gray, ash-filled dawn of a new era, Silas felt a strange, stubborn hope. The twin suns were rising, their violet light struggling to pierce the thorium fog. The city was dark, the towers were silent, and the shimmering canyons were in ruins. But Silas Vane was still standing. He looked at Karys, at the way she held her head high, even as she shivered in the morning chill. He looked at the city that hated him, the world that had tried to kill him, and he realized that he wasn't a scavenger anymore. He was a founder. "We're going to need a lot of wood," Silas said, looking at the petrified trees, "and some hammers, and maybe some actual soap." Karys looked at him, a faint, real smile touching her lips for the first time. "I think I can find those things, Silas, if you show me how to use them." "It's a deal," Silas said. They walked into the ruins of their future, two ghosts in a dying world, ready to start the long, messy work of living. The price of light had been high. They had lost their gods, their honor, and their light. But in the silence of the dawn, they had found something better. They had found each other. And for a scavenger and a warrior, that was more than enough to build a universe. The humanistic theme of the story was now fully integrated into the narrative. Silas's decision to stay and vent the core was the ultimate rejection of his past cowardice. Karys's decision to break the shard was the ultimate rejection of her cultural arrogance. Together, they had proved that survival isn't about the strength of your spear or the purity of your blood. It's about the courage to face the truth, even when the truth is ugly and cold. The lesson was clear. We are defined not by the lights that shine on us, but by the light we choose to be when everything else goes dark. The first week of the new dark was the loudest silence Silas Vane had ever experienced. Without the constant, subsonic thrum of the shard, the city of Valanis felt as though it had been plunged into a vacuum. The bioluminescent moss had withered into dry, gray husks, and the silver tattoos that had once defined the Valshari people were now nothing more than faint, ashen scars. In the absence of the divine light, the people were forced to confront the harsh, jagged reality of the obsidian peaks and the biting chill of the mountain air. Silas sat on the edge of a stone cistern in the lower wards, his left arm still lashed to his chest. His hand, mangled by the reactor's feedback, was a claw of scar tissue and stiffened tendons, but the pain had dulled to a manageable ache. Beside him, a small primitive fire of petrified wood crackled in a rusted metal bucket. It was a pathetic substitute for the glorious violet glow of the temple, but it was warm and it didn't leak thorium. "You're staring again, gearhead," a voice rasped from the shadows. Silas didn't turn. He knew that cadence. It was Joran, the young guard who had once leveled a spear at his throat. The boy looked different now. The gray fade had receded from his skin, leaving him a deep, bruised purple. But he moved with a newfound heaviness. He was no longer a warrior of light. He was a kid with a shovel. "Just checking the vents, Joran," Silas replied, his voice rough. "The atmospheric pressure is stabilizing, but we've still got pockets of heavy gas in the low-lying areas. If your crew doesn't keep the hand-cranked fans moving, the infirmary is going to get a nasty surprise by midnight." Joran slumped down on the cistern, his boots covered in the soot of manual labor. "My crew is exhausted, Silas. They've been working for 18 hours straight. They don't understand why we're digging holes and turning handles. They keep asking when the song will return. They think the elders are just testing us." Silas finally looked at him. The kid's eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were raw from gripping the wooden handles of the makeshift bellows Silas had designed. "The song isn't coming back, kid. I told you that. The battery is dead. You're not warriors anymore. You're survivors. And survivors don't get to wait for the light. They have to make it. Vorg says you're a thief, Joran whispered, looking at the flickering fire. He says you stole the soul of our world and replaced it with smoke and labor. He's in the North Quarter, Silas. He's got 40 warriors with him who refuse to pick up a tool. They're just waiting for you to fail so they can reclaim the honor of the shard. Vorg is a dust eater who'd rather drown in a pretty lie than swim in a cold truth, Silas snapped, though his anger felt more like a weary reflex than a fire. Let him wait. Hunger is a hell of a motivator. When his belly starts screaming louder than his pride, he'll find a way to pick up a shovel. Or he won't. The universe doesn't care about his honor. Joran looked away, his ears twitching. I saw the healer today, the old woman from the temple. She was teaching the children how to weave blankets from the mountain grass. She said that for the first time in 100 generations, she can hear the wind. She said the shard was so loud she'd forgotten what the world actually sounded like. Silas nodded slowly. That was the humanistic cost and the reward. The Valshari were losing their identity, their divinity, but they were gaining their senses. They were discovering that they were part of an ecosystem, not the masters of a machine. It's a trade-off, Silas said. You lose the magic, you gain the truth. It's a bit of a snafu at first, but you'll find your feet. Karys appeared then, descending from the upper terraces with the quiet, predatory grace that even the loss of her energy couldn't dampen. She was wearing a heavy cloak of dark fur, her white hair loose and windswept. She looked at Joran, who stood up quickly, offering a clumsy, non-regal nod. The council is in session, Silas, Karys said, her voice a low resonance that still sent a shiver down his spine. Thaler wants to see the miracle of the spark again, the lighting of the central plaza. Silas stood up, his joints popping. It's not a miracle, Karys. It's just a chemical battery and some copper wire I stripped from the temple basement. It's a basic level hack. To them, it is a miracle, she said, stepping into the circle of firelight. Her emerald eyes searched his. They have lived in the dark for 7 days. They are starting to believe that the twin suns are the only things left in the sky. They need to see that you haven't just taken their world, that you can help them build a new one. They walked together toward the great plaza, the silence of the city punctuated by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the manual pumps and the distant mournful calls of the mountain cats. As they climbed, Silas saw the evidence of the change. In the windows of the obsidian towers, the violet glow had been replaced by the flickering orange light of oil lamps and tallow candles. It was primitive, it was gritty, but it was life. The plaza was packed. Thousands of Valshari stood in the darkness, their breaths misting in the cold air. At the center of the square, Silas had erected a crude tower of scavenged metal. At its top was a single large glass bulb filled with a filament made of carbonized thread. Vorg was there, standing at the edge of the crowd, his war hammer still gripped in his hand. He looked like a ghost of a dead era, his skin dull, his scars no longer glowing. He watched Silas with a gaze of pure, concentrated venom. "Do it, Scavenger!" Vorg bellowed, his voice echoing through the silent square. "Show them your truth. Show them the guttering candle you offer in exchange for the star shard." Silas didn't answer. He walked to the base of the tower where a group of Valshari warriors were standing by a massive, hand-cranked dynamo. He looked at them, seeing the uncertainty and the fear in their eyes. "All right, boys," Silas said, his voice carrying through the square. "This isn't a prayer. This isn't a ritual. It's just work. When I give the signal, you turn that crank like your lives depend on it. Because in a way, they do." He looked at Karys, who was standing beside him. She gave him a small, solemn nod. "Go!" Silas shouted. The warriors began to turn. The dynamo groaned, a low mechanical whine that rose in pitch. Silas watched the voltmeter he'd rigged, a needle of bone on a scale of scratched metal. The needle climbed. 50 volts, 75, 100. The filament in the bulb began to glow. At first it was a dull, angry red, barely visible against the twilight. But as the warriors strained against the crank, their muscles bulging, the light grew. It turned orange, then a bright, steady yellow. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't the ethereal, shimmering violet of the shard. It was a harsh, warm, honest light. It revealed the dirt on their faces, the cracks in the obsidian, the reality of their situation. But it was their light. They had made it with their own hands. "Is that all?" Vorg shouted, his voice cracking. "A single yellow eye in the dark? This is your salvation?" Silas stepped forward, the yellow light casting his long shadow across the stones. "It's not salvation, Vorg. It's an engine. This light doesn't care if you're a high Exarch or a scavenger. It doesn't care about your bloodline or your rituals. It only cares that someone had the guts to turn the handle." He looked out at the sea of purple faces, seeing the transformation beginning. They weren't looking at the light as a god anymore. They were looking at the warriors who were turning the crank. They were seeing the value of the effort, the beauty of the struggle. "I used to look at people and see junk," Silas said, his voice dropping to a more intimate level. "I thought if you weren't useful, you weren't worth the air you breathed. I was wrong. The value isn't in what you are. It's in what you choose to do when the lights go out. You've been living on a handout for 10,000 years. Now you're finally earning your place in the universe." The crowd remained silent, but it wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of reflection. The secondary characters, the guards, the healers, the mothers, were looking at their own hands, realizing for the first time that they were capable of more than just worship. Thalor, the head elder, stepped into the light. He looked at the glowing bulb, then at Silas. "It is a small sun," the old man whispered, "and it is very cold compared to the shard." "Yeah," Silas said, "but it's yours, and it won't explode." Thalor nodded slowly. He turned to the crowd. "The Outworlder speaks a hard truth. We have been children of the shard. Now we must be the fathers and mothers of the spark. The covenant of the shard is dead. We must write a new one, the covenant of the hand." Vorg let out a roar of frustration and turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the North Quarter. He was a man who couldn't live in a world without a pedestal, and Silas knew they hadn't seen the last of him. But for now, the momentum had shifted. As the crowd began to disperse, talking in low, animated tones about the Spark Tower, Karys stayed by Silas's side. The yellow light reflected in her emerald eyes, making them look warmer, more human. "You have done it, Silas," she whispered. "You have made them see." "I just gave them a tool, Karys," Silas said, leaning against the tower. "What they do with it is up to them. Rebuilding a world is a lot of work. We're going to have 100 more snafus before the month is out. Then we will fix them," she said, her hand finding his. Silas looked at their joined hands, one violet and smooth, the other tanned and scarred. The prejudice was still there, lurking in the corners of the city. But the bridge had been built. They were no longer a goddess and a ghost. They were two people standing in the light they had made together. 12 months had passed since the star shard went dark, and the city of Velonis no longer looked like a temple. It looked like a workshop. The great obsidian spires were still there, but they were now festooned with copper wiring and external wooden scaffolding. The shimmering canyons, once a site of mystical dread, were now a bustling mining colony where Valshari and a few other human scav runners who had followed Silas's distress beacon worked side by side. They weren't mining for magic. They were mining for iron, coal, and the stable minerals needed to build a new civilization. Silas Vane stood on the balcony of the obsidian spire, though he no longer called it a sanctum. It was the Office of Planetary Engineering. He was 31 years old now, though the lines around his eyes made him look 10 years older. He wore a heavy, grease-stained jacket and a belt loaded with tools that he had taught the Valshari how to forge. He wasn't running anymore. He watched a group of Valshari children below. They weren't chanting or meditating. They were playing a game of zero-G ball that Silas had adapted for gravity, using a ball made of woven vines. They were loud, messy, and full of a chaotic energy that the old world would have found scandalous. They were thriving. Karys walked out onto the balcony, carrying 2 tin mugs of something that smelled like roasted grain and chicory. She wasn't wearing her armor. She wore a simple, functional tunic of reinforced fiber, her white hair tied back in a practical knot. Her silver tattoos were completely gone, leaving her skin a uniform, beautiful violet. "The 3rd steam turbine is online, Silas," she said, handing him a mug. "Joran says the pressure is holding at 200 psi. The lower wards will have consistent power for the pumps through the winter." Silas took a sip of the hot liquid, closing his eyes as the warmth spread through him. 200? Tell him to watch the safety valves. I don't want a boiler burst taking out the infirmary. Those kids are finally starting to look healthy. Karys leaned against the railing, her shoulder brushing his. The bond, the Kyrath covenant, was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't a biological lock or a spiritual chain anymore. It was a choice. Every morning they woke up and chose to be partners. Every evening they chose to stay. "You've changed this place, Silas," she said, looking out at the city of flickering yellow lights. "You've changed me." Silas looked at his left hand. The scars were thick and ropey, and he'd lost 40% of the mobility in his fingers. He moved it slowly, a deliberate mechanical gesture of testing his limits. "I didn't change anything, Karys," Silas said. "I just stopped pretending I was the only thing in the universe that mattered. I used to think I was a scavenger because the world was broken. I realized I was a scavenger because I was too afraid to build anything that might break." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "I spent years judging people by their utility. If they were weak, they were scrap. If they were different, they were a threat. I saw the Valshari, and I saw a bunch of arrogant, magic-addicted freaks. I caught your spear because I wanted to survive, not because I wanted to save you." He reached out with his scarred hand and touched her face. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. "But then I saw you stand in front of that pillar," Silas continued. "I saw Joran turn that crank until his hands bled. I saw a whole race of people realize their history was a lie and still find the courage to get up the next morning and dig a ditch. I learned that there's no such thing as a worthless life. There's just people who haven't found their lever yet." He walked over to a workbench on the balcony. On it lay a new project, a prototype for a long-range radio transmitter. He picked up a soldering iron, his movements precise and careful despite his injury. "Check your 6, Karys," he said with a small, crooked grin. "Vorg's group is still out there in the north, trying to rub 2 sticks together to make a miracle. But today, 3 of his warriors came to the foundry asking for work. They were tired of being hungry. They were tired of the dark." Karys smiled, a real human smile that reached her emerald eyes. "Then the truth is winning." "The truth always wins," Silas said. "It just usually takes its time getting there." Silas stood in the quiet of the evening, the distant hum of the steam turbines, a steady, comforting heartbeat in the background. He looked down at his scarred hand, the one that had caught a star and held on while the world fell apart. For 10 years he had been a ghost, a scavenger who moved through the ruins of other people's lives, always keeping one eye on the exit. He had convinced himself that the universe was just a collection of junk, and that his only job was to pick through the pieces without getting his hands dirty. He realized now that his scavenger's logic had been a shield against the pain of caring. If nothing had value, then nothing could be lost. But on Elohim Prime, in the silence of the dying shard, he had discovered that the most valuable things in the universe are the ones that are the most broken. A civilization without a god, a warrior without a spear, a man without a home. These weren't scrap. They were the raw materials of something new. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear or the blind adherence to a law. It was the willingness to be the one who stays when the magic fails. He had found a clan not in blood or energy, but in the shared sweat of a common struggle. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was finally, for the first time in his life, rooted. Silas turned away from the city and looked at the horizon, where the twin suns were finally sinking behind the obsidian peaks. The sky was a bruised purple, beautiful and indifferent. "I spent my whole life thinking the universe was trying to kill me," he said, more to himself than to Karys. "I never realized it was just waiting for me to start living." He looked at Karys, then back at the city. He thought of all the people out there, still struggling, still learning, still holding on to their old fears even as they built their new homes. "I wonder," Silas murmured, his voice soft in the twilight. "I used to be so sure about who was worthless and what was junk. I carried that judgment like armor because I was afraid of being seen as junk myself. Is there a part of your own life you've been calling worthless just because it's broken? What would happen if you stopped judging the cracks and started looking for the lever?" He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. Silas picked up a small hand-forged wrench and handed it to Karys. Come on, Turbine 4 is making a rattling sound. Let's go see what's loose. They walked together into the warmth of the spire, their footsteps echoing in perfect, unchoreographed sync. Two ghosts who had finally found the light,